All right, we're very happy to have on Noisy Reality today Jack L. High. I'm correctly pronouncing it, correct?
You are.
Okay, thank you. And Jack is the author of the book The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, which the 2025 movie Nuremberg is based on. This movie has been adapted into this book, excuse me, movie. This book has been adapted into a movie that stars Rami Malek and Russell Crowe playing Hermann Göring. And of course, Rami plays Dr. Douglas Kelley. Uh, Jack has written articles for actually over 500 articles to Atlantic, Smithsonian, GQ, Scientific American, Wired, and many other publications. In addition to Nazi and the Psychiatrist, or The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, his books include The Lobotomist, a Maverick medical genius, his tragic quest to rid the world of mental illness, Face in the Mirror and the Lost Brothers, a book about Northwest Airlines, and he also wrote the Lost podcast, which is an adaptation of the Lost Brothers. Well, I want to thank you so much, Jack, for taking time today to talk to us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me here, Jim.
And I should also note that we have with us Jonathan Bush, who is a lecturer at Columbia Law School and has specialized in war crimes trials or war crimes in general. Jonathan, when he was younger, was a prosecutor. Were you not in the federal government chasing Nazi war criminals?
I was
Okay, so
also junior there too.
Junior there too, yes. So we're going to call on Jonathan throughout this whole affair. Now, first of all, I want to thank you, Jack. And we're going to have to ask some questions that I sort of laugh at because to actually ask people who Hermann Goering is an amazing question to ask because all of us here, most of us are baby boomers. So it's sort of a de rigueur question that we all know. But how did you get interested? Let me start with first, how did you get interested in writing this whole book?
Before I wrote The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, I wrote an earlier book about another psychiatrist, and that book, as you mentioned, was called The Lobotomist. And that was about Walter Freeman, the psychiatrist who advocated and developed lobotomy as a treatment for psychiatric illnesses. And while this was more than 20 years ago now, while going through Dr. Freeman's notes, I came across his autobiography, never published, which mentioned a meeting that Dr. Freeman had with Dr. Douglas McGlashan Kelley in 1938. They met at a conference of the American Psychiatric Association, and Dr. Freeman was really struck by Dr. Kelley because Dr. Kelley was at the conference not to present a paper, not to give a talk, but to give a magic show. He was an avid stage magician, and he gave a magic show for this convened group of psychiatrists, which I think is very brave. I would not want to give a magic show for a group of psychiatrists. And so that stuck in my memory. It was lodged there for a few years. And then during that time, I had learned more about Dr. Kelley's career, that he had worked among the German defendants in the first Nuremberg trial, and I learned a little bit about his life afterward. And so I set out in search of Dr. Kelley's collected papers, and I found there was no such thing as Dr. Kelley's collected papers. And then I started looking for his remaining family members. I knew that Dr. Kelley had died in 1958. So it took a lot of tracking, but I eventually found Dr. Kelley's oldest son, Doug, living in Northern California at that time. And I wrote to Doug and I said, I'm interested in your father's career. It's really interesting. Do you have anything? And Doug wrote back and said, yes. Why don't you come over and take a look? And I was optimistically hoping for a scrapbook that Dr. Kelley may have kept, or a photo album, a few file folders. But when I got to Doug's house, he had brought up from his basement 15 banker's boxes of materials, most of which were papers and artifacts that Dr. Kelley had brought home to the US after his time in Nuremberg, which his time in Nuremberg ended in January 1946.
Hmm.
Most of those materials he probably should not have taken with him. They belonged to the US government. But he had them. He was interested in writing a book about his experiences. And so he took them along with some other people's papers. And there they were in Doug's house. And it was an incredible collection. And I saw right away that this material, which had not been looked at by anybody outside of the Kelley family for many decades, could form the foundation of a very intriguing book.
Now, one thing you talk about is it's a very interesting, fascinating story. His father was fascinated with the Donner expedition.
His grandfather,
His grandfather.
Yes, Charles McGlashan.
Yeah, and just give a little flavor of his personality and his sort of progression, because then he goes to University of California. He's sort of a wunderkind, winds up at Columbia University, becomes a shrink, and graduates in 41. But just give us the background of him as a person.
Well, the first person you mentioned, the grandfather, Charles McGlashan, is an important figure. It seems like every small town in the U.S. has a big man, a really important person. And in the town of Truckee in California, that was Charles McGlashan. And he was edited the newspaper. He took part in politics, civic affairs, but Charles McGlashan was also the first historian of the Donner Party. And some of your listeners may know that the Donner Party was this overland group going to California from eastern parts of the United States, who got caught in a terrible set of winter blizzards while crossing the Sierra Nevada mountains and had to winter in the mountains during that cold and snowful time. And the group resorted to cannibalism to survive. And all this had happened very close to Truckee, where Dr. Kelley's family lived. And in fact, Charles McGlashan operated a private museum devoted to the Donner Party. And so I mention this because Dr. Kelley, while growing up in Truckee and then later in the Bay Area of California, had a lot of darkness in his background, a lot of dark stories in his life. He grew up on the Donner Party. And as you mentioned, he did go to medical school at the University of California, then later Columbia. And at the start of America's involvement in World War II, he joined the U.S. Army and was assigned to field hospitals in Western Europe, which were primarily at that time handling not battlefield injuries, but war trauma cases, what was then called shell shock, today would be called PTSD for many of those soldiers. And he and his fellow physicians at these facilities developed effective ways to treat shell shock, effective meaning that they could help the soldiers overcome that trauma and return to the battlefield. And so at the end of the war, that's where Dr. Kelley was. He was among the highest ranking psychiatrists in the Army at the end of the war, and he was close by to where things were beginning to happen after the capture of the top German leadership, both civilian and military leadership. And he was brought in to work with those men, including Hermann Göring, initially to determine whether they were mentally fit to stand trial, because a trial was in the offing. And later, Dr. Kelley undertook a project of his own improvisation because he realized what an opportunity it was to be with these arch criminals of the 20th century and to learn more from them.
Now, I mentioned before we began, I was sort of surprised I would have to ask this question, but I will. Explain to the audience who Hermann Göring was.
At the end of the war, at the end of World War II, Hermann Göring was the top-ranking German official who was captured and arrested. He was a Reichsmarschall, which is, I think, probably equivalent in the U.S. to a six-star general. And there had only been one or two other Reichsmarschalls in German history to that point. And then he was the chief of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, and he held a slew of other titles, some ceremonial, some not, in the German government. So he was, for almost all of the war, Hitler's designated successor, and he was the top dog in the Nazi leadership.
Now, explain what Operation Ashcan was, and the importance of that in the story leading to the Nuremberg trials.
Ashcan was the code name for a hotel in a town called Mondorf in Luxembourg, where many of the men who would become the defendants in the International Tribunal in Nuremberg would first be held. And so that is where Kelley first went when he was given this assignment. The assignment was a mystery to him initially, why he was going there or who was there. But to start working with, in his appraisal of the mental fitness of these men. And Hermann Göring was among the very first there in Luxembourg that Kelley met. And Kelley had an initial assignment as a physician to help Göring with, and that was for Göring to lose weight and to overcome a quite serious addiction Göring had to a narcotic called pericodine. When Göring was arrested in May of 1945, he had with him most of the entire world's supply of pericodine. It was manufactured only in Germany at that time. Thousands and thousands of these tablets. And he was taking upwards of 75 or 100 a day to maintain his addiction.
Interesting. Now, just explain to us who Colonel Andrus is in this story.
Burton Andrus was the U.S. Army man assigned to be commandant of first Ashcan, the facility, a former hotel in Mondorf, Luxembourg, and then later in the jail in Nuremberg, next to the Palace of Justice, where the trial would be held. And so in that jail went all of the 22 defendants and many other Germans who had been arrested. It was a very large prison. And so he had a background in military prison management, and he took his job very seriously.
Now, explain some of the psychological techniques that Kelley's using, such as the Rorschach test, and the issue of him being a master of semantics and group psychotherapy that he'd been applying to GIs who had psychoneurotic responses to combat. How's he applying that when he comes into this situation with these head Nazi war criminals?
Even before he joined the U.S. military, Dr. Kelley was thought to be one of the foremost American interpreters of Rorschach test results. The Rorschach is the inkblot test that many of us are familiar with, in which the subject is shown an image. It's an abstract image made from ink blots, some all black and white, some in color, and asked to interpret what's on the card. And by listening to what the subject says and how the subject says it, and what the subject does while saying it, a skilled interpreter, it was thought at the time, could glean a lot and even diagnose mental illness. The Rorschach test at that time was used for diagnosis, and Kelley did it freely. But I don't think is used much at all, if ever, now as a diagnostic tool. It's now seen as more of a guide, a window into personality, but not something you would actually diagnose a psychiatric illness with. That was just one of the psychiatric tools Kelley came with. He also gave another test similar to the Rorschach called the thematic apperception test. This involved not abstract ink blot images, but realistic illustrations that the subject was asked to tell stories from, and he administered IQ tests. But what Kelley really relied on was interviews with all of the 22 defendants. He probably spent the most time with Göring, but he spent time with all of them, hundreds of hours. And through these many talks in their jail cells, he developed ideas about each of them and theories as to why they had ended up where they were. You also asked about general semantics. This is a train of thought, a theory of thought, I should say, that Kelley had used quite a bit in his treatment of shell-shocked soldiers, and he continued to use it after Nuremberg. It is very complex. And after researching it for many years, and I wrote my book in 2013, so that's 12, 13 years ago. Now, it is even hard for me now to tell you what general semantics is. But in general, it's a way of thinking that emphasizes rational thought carried over from generation to generation, as opposed to emotional response to stimuli.
Now, Jonathan, just if you want to jump in with a comment or question, please do.
Sure.
Tell us how he's reacting to these people as people, like Göring. But we don't. You only had Göring there. You had Rosenberg. You had Frank. You had Ribbentrop. You had a whole slew of them. Julius Streicher and Robert Ley. I mean, all this different head Nazis. But why does he, I guess, first, why does he get so attracted to Göring? And what's their relationship? And what insights do you get from looking at the other Nazis he's dealing with?
The relationship with Göring is one that I would never say ever developed into a friendship. They got to know each other well. They spent a lot of time together, and they recognized that they had a lot in common. I'm talking about Göring and Kelley. They were both highly intelligent. They were both charming men in their way, sense of humor. And most importantly, they were both master manipulators. And they both set about manipulating the other, with both of them fully aware of what the other was doing. And they had things they wanted to get from each other. Göring initially wanted Kelley to help him get closer access to his family, his wife and daughter, who for a time were imprisoned and then for a time not imprisoned. And Kelley wanted insights. He already, early in his time among these men, he had been planning to write a book, which materialized in 1947 as a book called 22 Cells in Nuremberg. And he wanted access, and he wanted Göring to be as voluble and as honest with him as possible. He wanted to see the real Göring. And for his research. So I think they grew to admire each other in a way. At least they admired the qualities they saw in the other that they themselves held. And Kelley never lost sight of the fact that Göring was ruthless, lacking in remorse, narcissistic, all kinds of unpleasant things. And so that's what that's just one of the things that prevented a friendship that from happening, aside from their status on opposite sides of the table.
And before I bring Jonathan in, the interaction I have about Ernst Röhm, I find very interesting. Just to describe that.
Yeah, there was an exchange between them about Röhm, and Kelley asked Göring, Röhm was a friend of yours. How could you possibly order this man's murder? He had been close to you for so long. And Göring's response was, he looked at Kelley like he was a naive child and said, but he was in the way, as if that explained everything. And in a way, it did explain everything about how Göring thought about such relationships.
Interesting. Jonathan, go on.
Let me make one comment first and then turn to the book, to the 22 cells. Just at the beginning, no need to criticize or be ashamed of what Kelley did in taking papers home. I mean, I don't know which papers he has, but I've interviewed, they're all dead now, but hundreds of people. Nuremberg, if it's transcripts, there were 100 copies. They needed, 10 for the Brits, and they needed 10 for the interpreters to work overnight to make copies for the judges. Everybody, I mean, if you go to a law firm now, you'll still see, even in the low-tech era, the high-tech era, you'll see in a corporate office bound copies of deals that people worked on. And it's considered, like a trophy. And Nuremberg participants were like that too. And I almost every one of them has things, and no one viewed it as theft because there were multiple copies, dozens and dozens of copies of everything. So Dr. Kelley did nothing wrong in that regard, provided that it wasn't a unique document, and almost nothing was. But turning to his book, there are books by one of the other psychiatrists and one of the psychologists all wrote books too, as you know, Dr. Gilbert and Dr. Goldenson. And if you read all three, Dr. Kelley's is stunningly the worst. It's really thin. It has nothing to say. It's not, he has little chapters about each of the defendants. Then he has chapters, which no responsible psychiatrist does, talking about people he didn't meet, like Hitler. Mm-hmm. And he talks about, he doesn't really get into much diagnosis. He does kind of little potted biographies and history. And so you obviously found a much richer and more interesting thinker and reactor. Was this all in his papers? Because you didn't find it in 22 cells.
Well, what I was looking for was a rich story. And so the vignettes that Kelley included in 22 cells give insight for someone who's interested in learning about Kelley's relationships with these men. It gives insight into what Kelley was interested in and what he took away from his time with those men. I was not as interested in reading about how he might diagnose them or how each of the defendants compared with other people, all of that. So it was good material for me in that sense. The papers that I looked at in Doug Kelley's living room also added to that kind of material because they included the medical records of each of the defendants. He asked each of the defendants to write an autobiography. Those were in there, and Kelley's notes about all the interviews he had, plus his Rorschach interpretations of each of the 22. So, and this is what makes me perhaps a little different from a historian. I never call myself a historian. I'm a journalist who writes on historical topics, who writes about history. But I am interested in identifying a story and telling the story. I'm a hunter of narratives, and my interests may not be the same as what some historians might have. But you're right, Kelley's book is very different from Goldenson's and from Gilbert's, and they came to different conclusions also about the psychoses and personalities of the defendants.
I mean, Gilbert in particular does much more talking to people the day after they testified or the day after they heard incriminating evidence and say, well, what did you make of that? What was said about you today? And Kelley doesn't do as much of that because he leaves early.
He wasn't there. Yeah.
Why does he leave when he does? Was his job initially to do the screening and get them ready for trial, and that you've done your job now?
Yes, I think he and his superiors felt that he had done his job and that he had gleaned enough from the defendants for his own project, his own interests, to take that material home and start writing his book.
Interesting. Now, one thing is going on in this relationship with him and Hermann Göring is he's basically trafficking messages between Göring's wife and Göring. And this was unusual. Was he the only person doing this, or were others doing this as well at Nuremberg?
It was certainly not sanctioned. He was doing it under the table. I don't know if others, whether they would be guards or attorneys working with the defendants or other people who had contact with them. There weren't all that many people who had contact with the defendants, whether they were doing similar things.
Mm-hmm. And describe to us Sergeant Howard Triest.
Howard Triest was a translator who worked with Kelley and some of the other people who had to have interactions with the defendants. I came across Howard because he self-published a book. It was probably about 20 years ago. And so I found him and interviewed him at the time. You may wonder, why did Kelley and some of the others need a translator? Well, Kelley knew almost no German at all. And so initially, Triest was helping him with those interviews. But as things aligned in Kelley's relationships with the defendants, Kelley grew closest to the defendants who knew English the best. And so that included Göring, included Rosenberg, Ley, and Stryker also knew some English. And so these are the ones that Kelley knew the most about, found out the most about, and wrote the most about. And then when Gustav Gilbert arrived a little bit later, he was a German speaker. And so he developed different kinds of relationships with the defendants. Gilbert was also Jewish, as Kelley was not. And so that helped define his relationships with some of the defendants too.
Now, what did Kelley, Kelley leaves in December. Is that correct? He leaves in December?
January 46.
January 46. And as he's involving himself with the trial, how's he interacting with the defendants? And what kind of insights do you get from the material you went over with some of these people, not only Göring, but these other people you examined?
Well, this question touches upon some of the real ethical problems in Kelley's conduct, or maybe not problems necessarily, but open questions. Because Dr. Kelley was among the first military psychiatrists ever embedded among war criminals. And so what was his role? Who was he responsible to? He was treating several of these men for physical ailments. He was treating them as a physician. So did he have a doctor-patient relationship with these men? Yet he was an officer in the U.S. Army. So he was beholden to the Army. And he had been brought to among these men by the International Military Tribunal. And so they had some oversight over what he was doing. And he also had connections with the prosecution team, which was interested in using Kelley to get inside information about how the defendants might decide to conduct their defense. And so it was a real tangle of questions there about who Kelley was responsible to. And so I think had this happened now, there'd be no question that Kelley overstepped boundaries and should not have divulged some of the things, say to the prosecution, that he had learned in conversation with the prisoners. But it wasn't now. It was 1945, 46. And it was a situation that few psychiatrists had ever been in before.
Of course.
Did he ever write about that?
Not much. He wrote about feeling conflicted when the trial's prosecution asked him questions, but ultimately he decided to answer those questions. So he did not, in his writings, he did not dwell on that.
Interesting. Now, one of the things you get into in the book is sort of the grand themes that people are still perplexed by Nuremberg and troubled by, and that is the Nazi mind arguments that you talk about. Many of us have read Walter Langer's The OSS Analysis of Hitler during the war, in the middle of the war. I've read Gilbert, I've read Goldenson. It was amazing to read all those different Rorschach test kind of interpretations. And then your discussion of what they were doing and how the movie portrays it's also interesting. But one thing that Kelley comes out with is that he says any society can do this. Any society, the Nazi mind idea is just throw that out the door. You know, if you have just share with us the conclusions that he makes about how this can happen anywhere. It's not something unique to German character, unique to the Germans, unique to the National Socialists. It can happen anywhere. What does he say about it?
Kelley came among the defendants with the hypothesis that they were afflicted with what he called a Nazi virus. Of course, it wasn't a physical virus. It was a mental virus, a disorder that many or some of them he thought might share, that accounted for their behavior, criminal behavior during the war and before the war. And he, through his various kinds of tests and interviews, he eventually concluded that there was no Nazi virus, that indeed these men, with the exception of Robert Ley, fell within the normal range of personality, and that instead of being afflicted by a Nazi virus, they instead were opportunists who took advantage of a political situation, military situation, to climb their way to the top, first of the Nazi Party, then of the German government. And Kelley also believed, as you said, that the war, the end of the war, was not going to stop people like that. The trials were not going to stop people like that from appearing. That they were always among us. That doesn't mean that everybody is capable of what they did, but there were always a certain percentage of people who, as Kelley put it, were willing to climb over the backs of half the population to exert power over the other half. And so when he returned to the States in 1946, he had been changed. His eyes were seeing different things than when he left. And he saw incipient fascism throughout this country, especially in the South, with the rise of the segregationist demagogues in the southern states. And so he went on speaking tours, denouncing them, and also proclaiming America's vulnerability to Nazi-like ideologies. and even laying out a plan by which America could avoid that fate.
And just tell us, how does his life end? Because it seems it's rather tragic and ironic how his life ends. And just tell us that story.
When Kelley returned to the States, it was with the belief that his medical specialty, psychiatry, could not explain the behavior of men like these German leaders. And if psychiatry couldn't explain it, what could? Well, that's when he began a gradual turn to criminology. He thought maybe the more social science approach could explain behaviors like this. So Kelley eventually became a professor of criminology at UC Berkeley, and over in the years, mainly the 1950s, he was a very emotionally volatile, unhappy man. He developed a drinking problem. He and his wife Dookie had serious marital problems. He began to feel persecuted during the McCarthy era and unappreciated by his colleagues for his accomplishments. And so on New Year's Day in 1958, the family was assembled at their home near Berkeley to watch the Rose Bowl football game. And Dr. Kelley and his wife Dookie got into an argument in the kitchen, and Kelley stormed out, went upstairs to his office/laboratory, and walked down the stairs and stood on a landing in view of everybody and held out in his hand this container full of powdered cyanide. And as Doug, the son, told me, and he was there, said something to the effect of, "Nobody understands me. I can't stand it anymore, and I'm going to do something about it." And he put some of the cyanide in his mouth and died almost instantly in front of his family. So that is how he ended. Doug, I talked with great length with his son Doug about what this meant. Why did he do this? What was the connection between Kelley's suicide and Göring's suicide, which was also done with cyanide poison? And so I develop in the book some explanations for that, some possibilities, but Dr. Kelley's end was very sad and very sudden.
That is just so powerful. And anyway, Jonathan, before we turn to other people, you want to have some other comments,
Yeah.
questions? Yeah.
Let me just ask a couple. I was struck when you said that of all the people the English speakers that he felt, I won't say friendly with, but tried to find explanations for, that among them were people like Stryker, whom, was, if there's one uniform rule, it's in Nuremberg memoirs, it's that everybody had contempt for Stryker.
Yes.
And the idea that, and on the other hand, almost everybody who had encounters with them was to a degree sympathetic, maybe even charmed by Speer, and was impressed by Schacht. And while he was far too haughty and arrogant to awaken any tender personal feelings, the fact that he was so clearly, the hero of the 1923 hyperinflation, and that he'd been liberated from a concentration camp at the end of the war, made him, lent an underlying credibility to his sense that I don't belong here. This is all just a mistake. So, normally Nuremberg memoirs of interrogators, of prosecutors, of judges even, are kind of sympathetic with Speer and Schacht. And in fairness, Schacht was acquitted, rightly or wrongly. And they're contemptuous to a man about Stryker. And Telford Taylor kind of had people gasping when he said, even though, of course, I agree he was contemptible, I think he was wrongly convicted given the legal framework that we were supposed to be operating under. And even that last phrase was considered, what? Just it's Stryker. So how come Dr. Kelley's reactions were so unexpected with some of these defendants?
I didn't mean to imply that Kelley grew to like Stryker, but
Yeah.
he found him a bountiful font of material that Stryker did not seek to hide himself or his motives. Stryker was Stryker in prison, just as he had been before prison. Yes, he was disgusting, but Kelley wasn't there to judge them. He was there to try to analyze and understand them. Speer is another interesting case because he was among the defendants that Kelley liked the least.
Yeah, I noticed that.
And I think it was because he considered Speer to be hypocritical, that he gave off, that he felt remorse, that he really didn't know so much about what was going on in the German government, and Kelley didn't believe it. Another of the defendants in the same category, hypocrite category, according to Kelley, was Hans Frank, because Frank had undergone what he said was a religious conversion during his time in prison, which Kelley did not believe at all.
May I offer one more thing? I was struck by your, your explanation of Kelley in the 50s, that he really thought it wasn't a German problem. It can happen here, and so on. And most Americans, most Brits, the reaction was basically favorable to Nuremberg, but we settled it. We took care of it. We got rid of the top Nazis. And, when Germans used to complain that Nuremberg was collective guilt, what it really was more like collective innocence, except for the ones that we got the worst ones, end of discussion. And if anything, this was enhanced by, McCloy and James Conant's, clemencies and so on. So we got the bad ones, and they've done a little bit of punishment, and we can move on. And one of the few people who kept saying, no, it can happen here, and I've seen it in Germany, was maybe surprisingly, Justice Robert Jackson. And I'm not one of those, like many Americans who look at it, who kind of think, that Nuremberg was Jackson's show. He made lots of mistakes. He was one of four, and so on. But repeatedly in Supreme Court cases, both with neo-Nazi rabble-rousers, Terminiello, Beauharnais, and with the communist threat in U.S. v. Dennis and other big cases, he would say, this is more important than free speech. When these people get started, it's a virus in the system. It can happen here. I've seen it at Nuremberg. And that was his footnote. He didn't even have to say it. I've seen it at Nuremberg. So he was the other one, like Dr. Kelley, who really said, it's not a German problem. It can happen here, and I'm willing to rule accordingly.
And I can understand that reaction in the US and in the UK and perhaps elsewhere, that we have finally concluded this unimaginably bloody and terrifying war. Let's hope that there won't be anything like it again. But Kelley was, as you point out, not among the people who thought that, and that prevailing feeling is probably partly why Kelley's book didn't do so well once it was published. Compared with Gilbert's, it flopped.
Yeah.
And did not sell very many copies, and did not, I mentioned that Kelley felt he didn't get the recognition he deserved. The book was part of that. He felt that the book did not get the recognition it deserved.
And they're both from 1947, and it's really toe-to-toe between the two psychiatrists.
Yep, the books came out within weeks of each other.
Yeah, one point I want to make before we bring in other people, and you all who want to ask some comments or questions, please raise your hands, is we haven't mentioned Rudolf Hess, of course, because Hess, magically got over his amnesia during the trial. And then the other aspect I'd like you to talk about before we bring in comments and questions is Hermann Göring wanted to go out in a blaze of glory. He wanted to, outfox them all, and just talk about Hess and also that aspect of Göring wanting to, you know, resuscitate the fact that I am in the new successor to the Fuhrer, etc., in the trial.
Well, Hess was a really unusual case among the defendants. He was very high-ranking. He was the deputy Führer, and in the beginning years of the war, he flew on his own initiative from Germany to Scotland, crashed his plane, and hoped in England to broker a peace of some kind between the British and the Germans so that they could join together and fight Russia. But the British were not going to have any of that, and hardly paid, paid any attention to what Hess had to say, and imprisoned him for the rest of the war. And then Hess was brought to Nuremberg once the trial was underway. And psychiatrically, Hess was an interesting case because starting from his time in Britain, he professed to have lapses of memory. He attempted suicide a number of times. And through his time with Hess and by observing Hess among his fellow defendants, once Hess was in Nuremberg, Kelley concluded that the amnesia was a sham. And Hess did, once the trial was underway, eventually admit to that, but he went back and forth so many times. Was he an amnesiac or not? It was hard to keep track. Kelley, for psychiatric reasons, found Hess to be interesting. But in terms of motivational reasons, why did the Nazis do what they did? Probably less so. And then your other question about Göring. Early on, I think Göring realized that if there was going to be a trial, he was going to be convicted and probably executed. And so he developed a plan to make the trial a defense of the German government before and during the war, and that is the blaze of glory that he hoped would result from his testimony and refuting the evidence brought against him, but that didn't happen. In the early months of the trial, Göring scored some points, made some gains, but the evidence was so overwhelming against him and the others that there was no blaze of glory, and the Göring and most of the others were convicted.
All right. Anybody wants to jump in, please raise their hands. I'll, because, I can keep on going. Absolutely no hesitation. And plus with Jonathan here and Volker here, I can really keep going. But yeah, go on, Michael.
Well, actually, I have a couple of questions, but just as to set the stage here, most of my research has to do with the first war crimes trial that was done, which is a trial of Kurt Meyer, which was done by the Canadians in Aarau, Germany, at the end of 1945. One of the grounds, in other words, he was supposedly he was being accused of the murder of Canadian prisoners of war and had the commanding officer giving the orders. They didn't convict him of actually giving the orders. They had no evidence that he actually ordered the prisoners to be murdered, but they did convict him as having been responsible because he was in command and having, through his command, set the stage by which those beneath him could be convicted. And I was wondering, since they were so close, I don't know how that might have affected Nuremberg, but was that applied? To what degree were they investigating him for that? Not necessarily for actually ordering the crimes, but for being responsible for the crimes. And the other question would have to do with the moral. In other words, it was a term that I've often thought was appropriate, called moral imbecility. And to what degree Kelley might have used that. In other words, where was the moral or ethical aspect of that? Thanks. Thank you.
Well, as to your first question about criminal responsibility as opposed to giving orders or carrying out orders, that's a little bit outside my lane, I think. And maybe someone with more expertise in the legal machinations of the International Military Tribunal could answer that better. Moral imbecility, I don't recall Kelley ever using that term. But it suggests to me, the term suggests to me that there is something morally deficient about them. And I don't know if Kelley believed that. I think he believed that these were men who had made choices. And it's not that they were lacking in morals and could not see that what they were doing was wrong. They simply chose to do wrong because of the personal advantages it would give them. So often people also ask me about whether Kelley considered any of these men psychopaths. And that term was very new at the time of this trial. It had been coined just a few years before. I'm not even sure that Kelley was familiar with it in 1945-46. I know he later became familiar with it because I saw a copy in his library of Cleckley's book about it. But Kelley believed that these men were responsible because they had made choices.
Interesting. Jonathan, you want to jump in on the command responsibility issue? You just have to unmute. You have to unmute. You have to unmute. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, you're muted again. You're still muted, man. You have to unmute, Jonathan.
There. How's that?
Good. Very
I'm
good.
sorry. See, you let a pandemic slip by and you forget how to use Zoom. Let me say two things about Mike's excellent question. One, did the Kurt Meyer trial influence Nuremberg, and the other, command responsibility. There were a number of important trials in the summer and fall of 1945 before Kurt Meyer. I mean, the Bergen-Belsen trial is October 45. There were a number of U.S. Trials of murderers of downed flyers. Small scale, one local thug murdering the crew of a downed aircraft. And I don't think any of them, except the Belsen trial, influenced Nuremberg in the slightest. And the Belsen trial convinced Nuremberg people that they were on the right track, because the Belsen results, they had about 45 senior camp personnel, and about a third of them were acquitted. And the traditional law of land warfare and jurisdiction said that pretty much if a belligerent kills personnel from the other side or its allies, that's a war crime. But killing stateless people, killing their own people, if German camp guards killed Germans, if Anne Frank dies in Belsen, which she did, that's not within the jurisdiction of traditional law of war, which is what the British were using. So I think Nuremberg people were, what I've seen in letters, in November, saying, thank goodness we have a broader mandate, crimes against humanity, so that we don't have to acquit people based on what we now call passive personality principle, which is what's the nationality of the victim, which is what the traditional law of war used. So the Belsen trial, I think, is really the one that influenced Nuremberg in this negative way. About command responsibility, it's funny. Most of the 22 people on trial at the first Nuremberg case, 21 who were there, probably never picked up a gun and shot another person, or even gave direct orders, please shoot the following, people. That's not the way a large government works. And I think that what we developed in a different case is a doctrine that the Americans best know from the Yamashita case, which was also at the same time in the Pacific Theater, where we basically said that General Yamashita, isolated as he was in Manila, was still responsible for the running amok by Japanese personnel, many of them naval and marine personnel, killing Philippine personnel. And it's basically considered the high watermark of command responsibility, because Yamashita probably was cut off, didn't even know, certainly never ordered, but was still deemed responsible. And it's ironic. I mean, most times command responsibility now, which is the darling of the international criminal law community, because you really can't show that Milosevic or any of these people, again, they're there on command responsibility grounds. And yet, so people love the Yamashita case, quoted all the time, and both jurisdictionally and in the way it was conducted, with MacArthur behind the scenes pulling the strings. It was a disaster. It's a due process disaster, but it's really where we get the notion of command responsibility, which has had long legs and is still alive and well.
Thank you, Jonathan. Volker, do you want to add anything on this? Do you want to jump in on any of this? You want to comment about command responsibility in Nuremberg at all, Volker? All right, well, let me know if you do. You can certainly unmute if you want. Before you do that, Mark, go on, Mark. Mark, you have to, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I do. I two questions, if you don't mind. The first one would be, did he ever face any legal actions regarding all the art that he stole? And second of all, has more modern psychiatrists looked at the primary data of, the interviews and everything, to look at it with a more modern, more scientific eye?
Those are good questions. So about the art, I'm not sure if art theft or cultural theft was among any of the charges against Göring. I know that Kelley did discuss it with Göring. Göring at one point before the trial laughingly claimed to have stolen 80,000 bottles of champagne from France. And I do know that Göring's wife, Emmy, was at one point charged with aiding and abetting in the art theft. But I don't know whether that was part of the proceedings against Göring in this trial we're talking about. And I'm sorry, what was the second question?
It was on the question. Yeah, go on. Repeat it, Mark.
Yeah, whether what do you call it, the raw data of the transcripts or any recordings had been looked at again by more modern psychiatrists with very more scientific, less Freudian sort of knowledge.
Yes. Well, I know that the Rorschach results and interpretations have been examined many times over the years by other psychiatrists. And there's a wide range of interpretations. Most overall, I would say, have sided with Kelley's interpretations, but not all. And I don't know about transcripts. There are no recordings of Kelley's interviews. So the Rorschach interpretations have been controversial at times, but I think so far the consensus has fallen on Kelley's side in those interpretations.
I'm a little surprised to hear that, in the sense that from my understanding, psychiatry was, as a science, was so new, and that there were so many ideas that were considered at the time to be scientifically valid, that today psychiatrists say no, that was total BS. They didn't know what they were talking about. And I'm also curious. You seem to be saying that there's next to no raw data, so to speak, on this. It was all it was all based on all we have is Kelley's and others interpretations, and that's not raw data.
That's right. You're right. There is little or no raw data.
Yeah,
Okay.
I just want to add to that, Mark. My sister-in-law was the general counsel of Human Rights Watch, and I used to listen to her talk about the question of psychologists and how they would deal with war crimes throughout the world. So it is an interesting question, and one which would be I certainly would like to know more about it. Volker, please.
Yes, thank you, Jim. And, I'm delighted to get to know Jack also and his work, because even though I'm a historian of modern Germany, I haven't read your book yet. But my focus is not so much on Kelley, but rather on Göring. And you said at the beginning rightly that, of course, it was quite clear at Nuremberg that these defendants were responsible for the outbreak of the Second World War and, mass murder. But I wanted to ask you, how much did Kelley, suspect how deeply Göring was involved in the planning for the final solution of this Jewish question, as it was then called, within the regime, actually? And that is, of course, the crunch question in many ways of how to evaluate that regime in spite of all the other crimes that they committed, the mass murder of the genocide of millions and millions of men, women, and children. And now, of course, we know much more about this. Richard Overy's book on Göring, etc., will contain a lot on this decision-making process. But how far did the interrogators, find out something about that crime that happened? Or was it just a focus on war and unleashing war, etc.?
Dr. Kelley came to his time with the defendants knowing not much about the Holocaust. And it was only over the months that followed that he learned more about it and learned more about Göring's role in it. And it was only later that he began questioning Göring about it. And he found Göring to be slippery not surprisingly, slippery on in his answers about that. Göring claimed not to be anti-Semitic. And when Kelley pressed him on that, Göring said that this was just one of the beliefs of the Nazi Party when Göring joined in the early 20s. And it's what you had to do to rise in the party. And Göring said that his objective was to rise in the party. He chose the Nazi Party among many other right-wing parties he could have joined at that time because it was small and relatively disorganized, and he saw a quick way to the top in it. He claimed that nobody really believed that anti-Semitic stuff, and it was all about reestablishing Germany as a world power, and helping Germany achieve its destiny. It was about patriotism, according to Göring, not anti-Semitism. And so he was reluctant in his talks with Kelley, reluctant to talk at all about the Holocaust, and didn't even, Kelley was long gone by this time, but didn't even start saying much about it until he was on the witness stand and faced with evidence.
Could I add a few things about Göring? To go back to what we said before about art, just to follow up. I mean, the starting point has to be that with all the people who were charged, remember, Germany is bankrupt. Nobody owns anything. Nobody's clear what the rules are. And if you're arrested, you have nothing. You have a bunch of useless Reichsmarks in your pocket. So all of the fantastic art that was Karinenhall, that Göring had stolen, was under Allied control. Much of it was restituted to national museums from which it had been taken, like the Louvre, the Uffizi, and so on. The art that's been much more unevenly restituted, and sometimes not at all, was that owned by wealthy German Jews, where it was said, well, there's no one here to claim it, we'll hold it. But things held by public museums and looted by Göring pretty much were all given back. One of the ironies about restitution is that a senior Nuremberg prosecutor, both at the first trial and at the later ones, Robert Kempner, who was a German emigre himself, had a lively practice in restitution law and was the lawyer for Emmy Göring as she successfully got restitution later as a victim of World War II, someone who suffered in World War II. The mind boggles. But, Kempner, I guess lawyers do what they do, take any case. And finally, about Göring and anti-Semitism. I mean, in a way, it's the accident of the way a trial flows. I mean, it's beyond Dr. Kelley's time at Nuremberg, but famously, Jackson, thinking himself the first among the equal of the chief prosecutors, wanted to go first in interrogating Göring and made a hash of it. Invited him to talk generally and give political disquisitions, and to redeem that and to really nail Göring to the wall. The British chief prosecutor, de facto chief prosecutor, basically looked at one thing: the murder of the escapees from Stalag Luft 50, the basis for the movie The Great Escape, the murder of the 50 or so escapees. And I think he takes 20 minutes on the cross-examining. Is this your signature? Did you have anything to do with it? No. Do you recognize this paper? No. Do you recognize the signature? Yes. Could you tell the court who that is? That's me. Could you read it out loud? I hereby order them all to be given over to the Gestapo for special treatment. Thank you. No other questions, Your Honor. So that's because of the needs of cross-examination. Litigation needs meant that the Allies had no desire to reopen the door about how much he knew and what he told Heydrich in 1942. It's just, you got him. You got him on mass murder in front of a British chief judge for ordering the murder of 50 Brits. You don't have to say anymore. So I think much of it was available at Nuremberg. Much of the connections with Göring and the final solution. And whatever wasn't known, a lot more came out as the Allies continued to gather evidence, particularly for the case 11 of the 12 cases, the Ministry's case, where many of Göring's senior deputies were on trial. But the Nuremberg stuff had lots. Obviously, historians have gone way beyond that. But I don't think anyone denied that he was guilty of crimes against humanity, as well as atrocity things, as well as war making.
Maybe you and Jonathan should get together, because he's doing a biography of Telford Taylor, Jack. But I wanted to sort of move into sort of, as we finish this, and Mark, I saw you raise your hand. I don't know where you went. Is the impact of making a movie like this? Because we haven't really talked about the movie, which I think has an excellent ensemble. Russell Crowe did a great job playing Hermann Göring. And when you were working on the movie, I think you mentioned before we began this, that the director wanted to have people know who Hermann Göring was. And just give us a sense of you're coming out with a movie in the midst of our country having the major party in power having a scandal within it over elements of that party, the GOP, actually advocating admiration for Hitler and Nazism. We've had these all this break, the whole uh, emails back and forth with low-level officials talking about how they admire Hitler, etc. And this latest fiasco with Nick Fuentes and all the rest of these people. And I'm just wondering, making a movie like this, in a time like this, it has a responsibility to it. And I'm wondering how that sort of feeling or not was present in the work you did, because you were also a producer of the film. Is that not correct?
Executive producer.
Executive producer. Okay,
Yes.
very good.
And that's, I have to point out, is really not a job. It's more of a title.
Title, okay.
So maybe the best way for me to answer this is to tell you that I am happy with how the movie came out, and I feel comfortable recommending it to my friends. And that's because the movie is mostly factual, and not that in a movie there's any virtue in being factual. Movies are entertainment devices, but I liked it, that it's mostly factual. And also that some of the messages that were important to me in my book carried through into the movie. One of those messages was, here's an example of the international community getting together to mostly successfully prosecute people who committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the rest of it. We don't see that happening very much today. And our world would be a better place if we saw it more. That's my belief. And then the other message is that, as we discussed earlier, the end of the war, these trials, the creation of the UN, all of that, high hopes for all of that in ending horrific genocides and war crimes didn't have that effect. We have genocides now. We have war crimes now. And we have to expect it, not in the sense of giving up to it, but preparing for it and having plans for when those terrible things arise and we are confronted with them, not to hide from it or to wish it wasn't happening, but to do something about it. And I wanted readers of my book and viewers of the movie to start thinking about those things. And if that can happen through a major Hollywood production, wow, that is fantastic, because a movie has much larger reach than my book will ever have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Michael, you'll have the last word, Michael. Go on. You have to unmute Mike. Yeah.
Yes. Actually, I'm asking this because I thought some a friend of mine was going to be on, but he's not. And it has to do with Göring and the allegedly Göring helping some Jews escape, and whether or not that factored in, probably through his brother, I would imagine. And also the manner in which he died. How the cyanide, how that thing actually took place. I mean, the story we know is that one of the guards gave him a cyanide pill, etc. But was there anything more to it than that? And also, I'm just going to throw in, if even though this is not a word that was probably used back then, but if a narcissistic personality would be attributable today to Hermann Göring.
Oh, gee, what are you talking about?
I think it's pretty obvious, but I just wanted you to dwell on it. That's all.
Yes. Well, I'm not a psychiatrist, so I cannot diagnose anyone. But lots of times narcissistic behavior is easy to spot. And so it looks to me like Göring was a narcissist. And if you're asking about whether I think Donald Trump is a narcissist, the answer is yes, I do. The cyanide, so there have been a lot of theories about that. How did Göring get it? He certainly arrived at Ashcan and then later Nuremberg with a supply of these capsules that were issued to many members of the German leadership, many of whom used them. And I think the most plausible explanation of how Göring got a hold of it was with the help of an American guard who likely exchanged the cyanide capsule. I believe there were two of them. One was still in Göring's cell after he had used the other. And in exchange for jewelry and rings and trinkets and things like that. You'll have to remind me, what was your first question? Because
it had to do with the fact of Göring allegedly, or maybe he claimed to have allowed to help certain Jews, and whether or not that was because of his brother, and also how that might have figured in, or did he claim it, or whatever.
Göring did tell Kelley a story about helping Jews escape or escape punishment, prosecution, I think at the urging of his wife. I don't know whether that happened. And I believe Göring discussed his brother at least once, and not in flattering terms.
Interesting. Interesting. Now, just to end this, the question of aggressive war was one of the tenets of the Nuremberg war crime trials. And that, of course, has never really, we can see what happened with that idea for the past 60, 70, 80 years. And we never talked about Dönitz or Keitel or Jodl and Operation Barbarossa being planned as aggressive war. How does that, and I know you didn't necessarily talk about that in the book at great length, although that was something, of course, that Kelley would have been exposed to being in a trial, but just, that whole question, just to end this, is, how did he look at those people, and how do your reflections about the whole process of the Nuremberg war crimes trial and its impact today, or lack of impact today, in our present world?
The attacks on civilians did come up in Kelley's talks with the defendants, especially with Göring. Kelley asked him about the bombing of Rotterdam, and Göring's response was to say, "Yeah, but look at Hiroshima and Dresden." And that may be a good debating point, but it doesn't absolve him of, or the other German military leaders, of their responsibility for what happened in those European cities that the German Air Force and military in which they targeted civilians. As to why today, that's one of the most disappointing aspects of this story to me now, that our country, which was such an important part of this international military tribunal and all of the other trials that followed it, no longer participates in trials of that kind. The International Criminal Court and others, we don't take part, we don't recognize decisions, we don't assist, and in fact, in the current administration, we condemn. And And when a change of administration happens, I hope that's one of the first things that will change.
Well, we want to thank Jack so much. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time today. It really was very productive and stimulating to hear your thoughts about your book and the movie that you participated in. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and with such an illustrious crew here. I'm really grateful to all of you.
Well, you did a great job, and congratulations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.